Johnny Carson spent 30 years behind that desk watching thousands of stars walk across his stage. But there were 8 women who made even him forget his next line. 8 faces that stopped studio crews cold, silenced audiences, and left America's most composed host visibly shaken. This isn't just about looks. It's about presence, the kind that bends a room the moment it walks in. Tonight we're counting down the 8 most stunning women ever to sit on that legendary couch, and why Johnny Carson himself couldn't look away. Ursula Andress. She walked out of the ocean and changed cinema forever. When Ursula Andress stepped onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time, she carried something no other guest brought with her, the weight of a single moment that had already made her immortal. That white bikini, that Caribbean shoreline, that walk out of the water in Dr. No had rewritten what glamour looked like on screen, and everyone in that studio knew it the second she appeared. Johnny Carson, a man who had interviewed royalty, presidents, and the biggest names in entertainment, actually lost his place mid-sentence the first time he introduced her. He looked at the monitor, saw her waiting in the wings, and simply forgot what he was saying. It only lasted a second, but for a host known for total control, that second said everything. What made Andress different from the other beauties who sat on that couch wasn't just her looks. It was her total lack of apology for them. American actresses of that era were taught to deflect compliments, to laugh them off, to seem almost embarrassed by their own beauty. Ursula did none of that. She accepted admiration the way she accepted a compliment on her accent, calmly, directly, without a trace of false modesty. That confidence unsettled Carson in the best possible way. Her European bluntness became must-watch television. Where other guests softened their answers to sound more palatable, Andress answered exactly what she thought. When Carson eventually asked her about that legendary beach scene, her response needed no embellishment. She said something close to, "Of course it changed everything. One does not create a moment like that and expect life to stay the same." No hedging, no humility for the sake of humility, just plain acknowledgement of reality. Carson found that kind of honesty almost impossible to find in Hollywood, and he said as much to people close to him after the taping ended. Behind the cameras, her appearances created an atmosphere unlike any other guest that season. Crew members who normally joked around between takes went quiet. Pages who usually rushed through their duties suddenly found reasons to linger near the set. It wasn't chaos like some of the other bookings caused. It was closer to reverence, the kind of hush that settles over a room when something genuinely rare walks in. Carson respected her precisely because she didn't need the audience's approval to know her own worth. She had already created one of the most iconic images in film history, and she carried that knowledge with quiet certainty rather than performance. For a host who spent his life studying the difference between real personality and rehearsed charm, Ursula Andress was proof that some people simply do not perform beauty. They embody it, without effort, without apology, and without ever needing anyone else to confirm it. Diane Carroll. She never raised her voice, yet she commanded every room she walked into. When Diane Carroll appeared on The Tonight Show, she brought something rare, a beauty paired with quiet historical weight. As the first black woman to star in her own network series without playing a stereotype, her presence on that stage meant something far bigger than glamour. Carson understood this the moment she sat down, and he treated her with a level of respect he rarely extended to anyone else. Most guests showed at least a flicker of nerves before facing Carson. Diane never did. She sat down as if this were simply another afternoon, completely composed, completely herself. That stillness combined with her sharp intelligence gave her an aura that felt both warm and regal at the same time, something the crew described as watching someone float rather than walk. What set her apart from other stunning guests was her refusal to shrink her intellect to seem more approachable. She spoke openly about the barriers she had broken, the limits still placed on black actresses in Hollywood, and the responsibility she felt carrying that platform. She never lectured. She simply stated truth with such natural grace that audiences absorbed it without ever feeling preached to. Carson admired that skill more than almost anything else he saw in a guest. There was a moment when Carson asked about a recent role, and Diane calmly redirected the conversation toward the lack of real opportunities still available to actresses who looked like her. She did it so smoothly that no tension followed. Most guests would never have dared shift Carson's own question back onto him. When she did, it felt completely natural, almost inevitable. Backstage, her bookings created a different kind of energy than any other guest. There was no scrambling, no nervous joking among staff. Just quiet, focused respect. Everyone understood they were in the presence of someone who represented both extraordinary elegance and genuine cultural importance. Her fashion choices reinforced that same timelessness, classic tailored pieces that never chased a passing trend, an approach Carson, a man of traditional taste himself, deeply appreciated. He once told those close to him that she understood something most celebrities never grasp, that real style outlasts fashion completely. For Carson, Diane Carroll represented something increasingly hard to find, a beauty built on substance rather than spectacle, one that didn't fade with each passing season but only grew more respected with time. Marilyn Monroe. She never once sat in that chair, yet she haunted it more than any guest who did. Marilyn Monroe passed away just months before Johnny Carson took over as permanent host, meaning the two never shared a single moment on camera. And yet across 3 decades on air, her name kept resurfacing, an invisible measuring stick against which every other guest was quietly compared. Carson would interview a rising sex symbol or a celebrated beauty, and somewhere in the conversation her name would surface, almost involuntarily. It became something close to a running thread through the entire show, a reminder that no matter how dazzling a guest was, there remained one name that represented something the audience could sense but never quite name. Carson himself once admitted she was the most beautiful woman who never sat in that chair, and he meant it with genuine longing rather than simple flattery. What fascinated him wasn't just her image. It was the tension underneath it. Carson believed that beneath the constructed bombshell persona was a far more complicated woman, intelligent, artistically ambitious, and quietly wounded by an industry that only wanted the surface. He often wondered aloud what an actual interview with her might have revealed, convinced she would have been one of the most compelling conversations of his career, precisely because of that contradiction between the public myth and the private person. His perspective on her evolved dramatically over the years. In his earlier seasons, references to Monroe leaned entirely on her status as the ultimate sex symbol. But as decades passed and more of her personal story became public, her intellectual curiosity, her serious dramatic training, her private world of books and unfinished poetry, Carson's tone shifted too. His comments grew more reflective, occasionally almost regretful, acknowledging how much of the real woman had been overlooked in favor of the fantasy everyone preferred to see. There was a moment when a film historian appeared on the show and mentioned newly surfaced details about Monroe's inner life. Carson listened closely, then later remarked to those around him that everyone had missed who she truly was, that the industry had simply seen what it wanted to see. It was an unusually introspective admission from a man who had spent his entire career reading people for a living. By his final years on air, Carson would occasionally muse privately about the guest he never got to have. Her name always came first. Not simply for her beauty, though that alone would have justified it, but because he believed she carried the ultimate story an interviewer dreams of finding, a woman whose public image had grown so large it eventually swallowed the very person living underneath it. Raquel Welch. She didn't just enter a room, she took it over completely. When Raquel Welch first walked onto the Tonight Show stage, something happened that almost never happened to Johnny Carson. He went speechless. For a host whose entire career rested on effortless control, those few seconds of visible hesitation revealed just how overwhelming her presence truly was. Audiences physically reacted the moment she appeared. Camera crews felt the shift in the room before she even spoke a word, a kind of collective intake of breath that swept through the studio every single time. What made her different from other stunning guests wasn't just her physical beauty, undeniable as it was, but the total confidence with which she carried herself. Where many actresses soften their looks with self-deprecating jokes or careful modesty, Welch moved with complete awareness of her own impact, and she never once apologized for it. Carson respected that instinct deeply. He once remarked to those close to him that she understood exactly what she was doing every second the cameras were rolling, her timing, her gestures, even the smallest movement, all of it deliberate, all of it controlled. It was less like watching an actress being interviewed and more like watching a masterclass in commanding attention. This wasn't simply about looking stunning. Welch had an intuitive grasp of television itself, long before media training became a science. Her instincts for pacing, for chemistry, for knowing exactly when to lean into a moment made her appearances feel electric rather than rehearsed. She brought sharp wit and playful tension into every exchange with Carson, understanding something most beautiful guests never fully grasped: that charm is what gets you invited back, not just beauty. Behind the scenes, her bookings created an atmosphere the crew jokingly called organized chaos. Staff who normally had no reason to be near set suddenly found urgent tasks requiring their presence. Engineers left their booths. Executives who rarely attended tapings suddenly appeared in the wings. Carson noticed it too, once joking that if she ever enlisted in the military, there would be no shortage of volunteers. Even Carson himself wasn't immune. There was one now legendary appearance where he lost his train of thought mid-question, glanced down at his card, then simply admitted he'd forgotten what he was asking. The audience roared, not because it was unusual for a guest to fluster him, but because with Welch, it happened more than once. What Carson admired most, though, wasn't the effect she had on a room. It was her self-awareness. She never resented being seen as beautiful, and she never hid behind it either. She understood exactly who she was, wielded it with intelligence, and built a lasting career doing precisely that. For a man who spent his life reading people, that kind of clarity was rare, and it earned his genuine respect. Bo Derek. The audience fell completely silent, and that silence said more than any applause ever could. When Bo Derek walked onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time, fresh off the overnight sensation of her film 10, something unusual happened. The typically loud, enthusiastic crowd went completely quiet, a stunned hush that actually forced Carson to pause longer than usual before starting the conversation. She had become an overnight phenomenon, but nothing on screen fully prepared people for seeing her in person. There was something about her presence in 3 dimensions that the camera, for once, had actually understated rather than enhanced. Unlike guests who arrived polished and rehearsed, Derek carried a natural, almost unaware quality about her own impact, and that unawareness became the very thing Carson found most captivating. He later admitted she was one of the few guests who made him lose his place entirely, not because of anything she said, but because of the strange disconnect between how extraordinary she looked and how ordinary, in the best possible sense, she seemed as a person. That contrast disarmed even someone as experienced as Carson. Her effect extended far beyond the host chair. Camera operators stayed locked on her even during moments meant to focus on Carson. Crew members who had seen countless celebrities pass through found themselves lingering near the stage. During one commercial break, Carson turned to his announcer and joked that he could read the phone book and the audience would still be mesmerized, only to be told they hadn't taken their eyes off her long enough to even notice he was still there. What made her rare wasn't just the reaction she caused, but how little she seemed to orchestrate it. She arrived without demands, without a rehearsed persona, without any of the calculated machinery that usually surrounded major celebrities. Carson, a man deeply attuned to spotting authenticity, recognized this instantly and respected it. He once told those close to him that she had no idea how beautiful she truly was, and that this unawareness made her twice as compelling. When Carson asked about her sudden transformation into a global sex symbol, her response carried the same disarming honesty. She said it felt strange because inside she still felt exactly the same as before. No performance, no false modesty, just plain truth. Carson replied that the rest of the world certainly didn't feel the same after seeing her, and the audience roared, sensing the genuine admiration behind the joke. For Carson, Derek represented something increasingly hard to find in an industry built on image control: natural beauty paired with natural behavior. She hadn't learned how to be famous, because fame had happened too suddenly for her to construct a persona around it. In an industry obsessed with performance, that raw honesty became the rarest kind of beauty Carson had ever encountered. Farrah Fawcett. One poster sold over 12 million copies and turned her into a cultural phenomenon overnight. When Farrah Fawcett walked onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time, the crowd's reaction ran so long and so loud that producers actually had to trim it down before the episode could air. It was a rare moment where even television's most popular show had too much applause to fit the broadcast. She arrived at a perfect cultural intersection, her breakout show, her iconic poster, and her effortless charm all colliding at once to create something bigger than typical celebrity buzz. People didn't just admire her, they lit up around her. Where other stunning guests created a hushed, almost reverent silence, Fawcett generated pure, visible joy the moment she stepped into view. Carson noticed this instantly, remarking to those close to him that she felt like human champagne. The entire room seemed to grow more bubbly the second she walked in. That energy carried directly into her conversations. Unlike guests who measured their words carefully, she brought open enthusiasm to every answer, something Carson found both refreshing and occasionally difficult to keep pace with. He once joked that if she appeared every week, he'd forget how to conduct an interview at all. Her spontaneity created some of the most memorable unscripted moments in the show's history. During one appearance, after Carson made a light-hearted comment about her famous hair, she immediately challenged him to try styling it himself, handing him a brush without hesitation. Carson, a man who almost never engaged in physical comedy with guests, actually stood up and attempted a few careful brushes, visibly nervous about ruining her signature look. The audience erupted, and the moment became one of the most talked-about exchanges of that era. She met Carson's playful flirtation with equal warmth rather than discomfort, creating an easy chemistry that never felt uncomfortable or forced. When he teased her about how her husband allowed her out of his sight, she shot back instantly that he trusted Carson completely, a perfect blend of charm and wit that made their exchanges feel effortless rather than staged. Behind the scenes, her bookings created a noticeably different atmosphere than most guests. Staff who typically dressed casually suddenly appeared in sharper outfits. Even Carson, famously consistent in his wardrobe, seemed to take a little extra care on the days she was scheduled. What Carson admired most wasn't just her beauty, but the kind of beauty it seemed to be. He once observed that she looked less like the product of careful image construction and more like the product of genuine good health, sunshine, movement, and energy rather than calculation. After years of interviewing increasingly polished and controlled celebrities, that natural vibrancy stood out to him as something rare, honest, and entirely her own. Elizabeth Taylor. Her booking alone was treated like a national event before she ever stepped foot in the studio. When word spread that Elizabeth Taylor would appear on The Tonight Show, network executives who normally left Carson to run his program without interference actually attended planning meetings just to prepare for her visit. She rarely gave television interviews at all, which made her appearance feel less like a routine booking and more like a genuine piece of television history in the making. The moment she arrived, the entire atmosphere of the studio shifted. Staff members who had worked alongside presidents and legendary performers suddenly found themselves straightening their posture, adjusting their clothes, almost involuntarily rising to meet the moment. She carried an aura that went beyond simple celebrity, a sense that everyone in that building was standing in the presence of genuine Hollywood history. Unlike typical guests escorted quietly to the green room, her arrival came with real ceremony. The head producer personally greeted her at the door, and Carson himself, who almost never met guests before taping began, made a rare exception just to welcome her personally. Those close to him later said he respected that she understood exactly who she was and never pretended otherwise. There was no false modesty, no performance of ordinariness. She knew her place in cinema history and carried herself accordingly. Her entrance reflected that same quiet command. Where most celebrities practically ran onto the stage seeking approval, she moved at a measured, deliberate pace, acknowledging the crowd with the smallest nod, somehow appearing both gracious and commanding at once. Other guests walked in seeking validation. She arrived already certain of her own worth. The interview itself became a rare shift in television dynamics. Carson, a man usually in complete control of any conversation, found himself gently working to draw her out rather than steering the exchange as he typically did. For once, the center of gravity in the room wasn't him, and he skillfully adjusted his entire approach to meet that reality rather than fight it. Even the production choices reflected the moment's significance. Lighting was adjusted specifically to capture her famous violet eyes. Camera blocking allowed for more intimate close-ups than usual. It wasn't just about showcasing beauty, it was about preserving a piece of cinematic legacy on screen. What struck Carson most, though, was her sense of mystery in an industry rapidly becoming more exposed and confessional. He later remarked that she kept something back, something private, at a time when most celebrities gave everything away. That restraint, that old-world sense of dignity, earned a level of respect from Carson that few other guests ever received, a recognition that he was speaking not just with a beautiful woman, but with the last living connection to an era of Hollywood that had already begun to disappear. Sophia Loren. The room changed the instant she walked in, and even Johnny Carson wasn't immune to it. When Sophia Loren made her first appearance on The Tonight Show, she brought something the American audience rarely encountered, an old-world elegance layered with a kind of sensuality that felt entirely its own. Her entrance alone, slow, deliberate, utterly assured, made it clear this was no ordinary guest. Carson, a man known for treating every guest with identical professional composure, visibly shifted the moment she sat down. He leaned in more than usual, laughed a little too easily, adjusted his tie more than once, small unconscious signals that those close to him recognized instantly as genuine discomposure. For someone whose entire reputation rested on effortless control, that visible reaction spoke volumes about the effect she had on him. Where American actresses often carried an easy, approachable warmth, Loren brought a European gravity that seemed to catch Carson slightly off guard. Her answers were thoughtful, sometimes provocatively delivered, and her accent transformed even simple observations into something that sounded almost poetic. Interviewing her felt less like conducting a conversation and more like trying to keep pace with it. What made her especially compelling was the contrast between her smoldering on-screen persona and her surprisingly reflective, thoughtful conversational style. Audiences expecting simple glamour instead found a woman discussing European cinema, the challenges of being taken seriously despite her looks, and her own experience growing up amid hardship in wartime Italy. Her beauty was only the entry point. What kept people listening was everything underneath it. Backstage, her presence created an entirely different atmosphere than most guests. Instead of nervous excitement, there was quiet reverence. Crew members who normally joked and moved casually between takes suddenly grew formal, almost ceremonial, treating her less like a typical celebrity and more like visiting royalty. It wasn't only about her appearance. It was about everything she represented, decades of cinematic history and collaboration with some of the greatest directors of her era. Carson engaged with her accordingly, asking substantive questions about her career and her artistic choices while still visibly caught in the pull of her presence. Those who worked closely with him described it as a rare mixture of awe and genuine intellectual respect, dazzled by her beauty, yet fully aware he was speaking with a true artist who had built her career entirely on her own terms. For Carson, that combination was irresistible. She never forced him to choose between admiring her beauty and taking her seriously as an artist, and that balance created some of the most textured, layered conversations of his entire career, delivered with warmth, intelligence, and just enough flirtation to keep the exchange alive.